Hey guys, this is Del K. Brereton, and this is the real spiel. I posted something in my community page yesterday, and I hope you guys would take a look at it. It was an editorial on a gentleman by the name of Wilhelm Bleek. Okay, he's a German linguist who did some study on African languages, and he came up with a bunch of stuff. Now, first and foremost, before we even start this video, I want to shout out to all of our members. Our member page, our member situation just got totally messed up. So I apologize to all the former members. I hope you can click the rejoin button. Rejoin me, your earth, wind, fire, spirit. Please rejoin and become back a part of the family and part of the movement. So let's have a conversation about Mr. Wilhelm Bleek. Now listen, the interesting thing about Europeans who decide that they're going to go on a study trip of Africa is that many of them essentially go in there and make up culture. They invent culture, they invent terminology, they totally ignore, based on ignorance most of the time, what has already been established as culture, and they make up their own thing. So William Bleek, he went in to South Africa, in the 1800s. And so when he went into South Africa, he came across what was in South Africa, multiple languages, right? Multiple languages of African people. And so let's get an understanding of what took place in South Africa before we even get to Wilhelm Bleek, right? It's not William, it's Wilhelm, right? Good old German boy from Berlin decided that he was going to become an expert in African languages. Just out of all of a sudden, you know what I'm saying? He's just going to become an expert in African languages. And interestingly enough, this started first and foremost by his study of Hebrew. That should give you a very strong indication, right? He started studying Hebrew. He didn't go to China. He started studying Hebrew. He didn't go to Europe, right? Didn't go to Russia, didn't go to Czechoslovakia. His study of Hebrew gave him a fascination of languages, which led him to Africa. Can you put those dots together? Afro-Semitic languages led him to Africa. We'll say that again. His study of an Afro-Semitic language. Afro, right? Meaning people of pigment, of color, of complexion, who were Semitic, not Hamitic, meaning not Africans, Afro-Shemitic people who had similar dialect, led him not to go to Europe, but to come to Africa. So let's start with that. I'll put that on part two. Part one, what took place in South Africa? South Africa, the Dutch settlers that came to South Africa, they came to South Africa for very basic reasons, why most European colonizers left England and left the Empire of Britain. They were trying to escape the autocracy of the British Empire. They didn't want to pay tax to England. That's what all these white fellas did. They came to America under the same conversation. They came to Canada, same conversation. They were sick and tired of an English monarch basically fleecing their pockets. And they said, we're out of here. We don't have to stay on this little rock. There's a big world out there. Let's buy some ships, get out of here. And we're not going to pay any money to this guy. We're going to have our own situation. And so they went all over the world. White people escaping the extortion of other white people went all over the world in the 1600s and on. And some of them, the Dutch, they wound up in South Africa. Now, when they got to South Africa, what do white people want to do? They want to oppress, colonize, and marginalize. This is what 17th century, 18th century white people did. This is what y'all did. 1500, 1600, 1700, that's what y'all did. But when they got there, some people, I'm going to say their name in the traditional sense. The Hokoi people, I'm just looking at some of the studies I wrote down. So the Hokoi people And many of you have watched movies and you didn't know who you were listening to, some of it. But the Hokoi people have a very strong click consonant, right? So I think good morning is g, g, iasin. I was studying a little bit of it to build up. I'm not doing it any justice. But they have a click consonant language. So when they say consonant, they click, and so it's this, concept that we hear from our Western linguistic ears, but they have a click consonant in how they speak. The West African does not have the click consonant, so their languages are different. Why? Because all black people are not monolithic, right? We are nations, tribes, cultures, creeds. We're different people that share our melanated complexion and share continental jurisdiction of Africa and the so-called Middle East. So let's start with that. So the settlers, they came and they found these folks. They're indigenous to the land, right? And what did they want to do? They wanted to oppress. But these the indigenous South African wasn't the best type of physical slave. They were bush people, they were small, they weren't necessarily individuals that they could utilize to do some of the laborious things that they wanted to be done. And so slavery was well underway, but the Hokoi people, they weren't necessarily enslaving them as roughly as they did other Africans coming out of West Africa, Angola, and other areas, right? Bigger bodied people like myself, built different, built stronger, right? And they utilized them for the heavy slave labor. And even at a period of time, and this is just true history, and sometimes we have to face it, the indigenous South African at times assisted in hunting the West African who was being brought in as slave, and hunting them in respect to when they escaped and whatever. So the Dutch settlers were German and Dutch, and they had this, of course, mixed language, and they referred to themselves later on. We know they referred to themselves as Afrikaners. They claim to be the indigenous people of South Africa, and of course start this intellectual lie of establishing themselves as the authentic original people of the area, right? Because we know in all American history and all world history, black history begins in slavery, right? Every time you do black history, our history only begins from the 1600s on. We weren't even a people before that. Our history always begins under the auspices of oppression. They never tell you what you were before. They never tell you who you were before. They never tell you what religion you were before. They never tell you what language you were before, right? Everything begins under the auspices of oppression. Black history only begins under what ex-slaves or marginalized people do. They never have a conversation about what took place prior to. Okay, so going from there, what we have is a Dutch settlement of individuals who came. Actually, I think the first Dutch settlers came in the 1600s. They were basically shipwrecked. They built a fort, and later on in the 1800s, they came to actually settle and to basically, again, do it exactly what I said, to manage a scenario where they didn't want to be part of the British imperial taxation system and separate themselves, right? So along comes now Wilhelm Bleek, and he's now studying, as a linguist, he's trying to study, all of these different types of languages, these different types of African peoples, and he invents terminology. And so many of us, don't realize that the word Bantu, that's not really an African term. That's a term created by a white German who wanted to differentiate Africans who didn't speak the click language, click consonant Africans, and Africans who came from West Africa who had different types of linguistic styles. And so this gentleman now decides to become an anthropologist and start to divide us up into terminologies that he was using, changing the ancestral name of people and creating new names, right? So Bleek's thesis, I can turn my phone a little bit so I can read this. His thesis really began in North Africa, and he called the original South African, who was called the Khoikhoi, Hottentot. He referred to them as Hottentot languages. I don't know if that's because he couldn't pronounce what they were trying to call themselves, but he went to the process of now trying to rebrand ethnicities and call people different things. So you have now Africans who are being broken up not just by the sound of their consonants, but by the arbitrary mentality of Wilhelm Bleek. Also, so you have the Bantu, who is the West African, and then you have the Nilotic Africans. The word Nilotic means Africans that are closer to the Nile. And so what they've differentiated is, people are different. People, you move around, they're different. Imagine you took Vietnamese people, Korean people, Chinese people, Japanese people, right? And you grab them all, you enslave them all, and you threw them into one culture, one melting pot culture. And then you and I walk in and we start dividing up all these so-called Asians. Now we don't call them Korean or Vietnamese or Chinese or Japanese. We don't do any of that. We create our own terminologies based on things that we identify. Oh, these ones are shorter, so we'll call them this. These ones, their language sounds a little funny, so we'll call their language this. So they're not only classifying the people, they're also classifying the language. And so and then we don't know the language. So I'm now declaring myself to be a linguist. I go to Korea and I'm trying to figure out, what the Korean language is. I show you an apple, I point, what's this? And you give me a name, and then I go to another one of you, and then I show you an apple, and you give me a different name. And I say, oh yeah, these are different people, because they're calling one thing different, right? When you very well know that sometimes that's not the case, right? That actually people of the same ethnicity can call something different with different slang, with different cultural languages. They can call things different things. Jamaicans and Trinidadians, who potentially are all West African individuals, will call something, we have a fruit called guinep, that we'll call it, both of us will call it different things, or we'll have a fruit called star apple, we'll call it different things. That does not mean we are of different ethnicity. It could mean we're of different culture, but culture is not always divided by ethnicity, right? Culture has a lot of real different things it can be affected by. So the point I'm trying to make is that even some of our early anthropology, when I say early, I mean 17th century and on, anthropology, the terminologies, the concepts were given to us by colonizers who didn't understand the language, didn't understand the people. They had a very, very specific agenda. They were undergirded by individuals who were trying to replace the indigenous people and refer to themselves as indigenous. They were trying to rewrite textbooks and rewrite forms of thought. And at the very front of it are individuals like Wilhelm Bleek. So we have to be very careful in adopting terminologies that did not actually come from us. We have to be very careful in who we read. We have to be very careful in who we use as reference sources. Okay, and even the flawed nature of their study can't be trusted. It absolutely can't be trusted. You cannot take a gentleman who walks into a culture he knows nothing about, and even though he immerses himself and refers to himself as a bushman, which this gentleman did, and sits there amongst the people, you are still studying from a place of ignorance. You are still studying from a place of presumptuousness. And then for the things that you don't understand, you simply create. So this is your 15 minutes of understanding that just because it comes from old books and old narratives and old anthropology doesn't make it accurate. Every single thing that the colonizers said about Africa, taught about Africa, referred to about Africa, cannot be trusted. It must be tested. Some of it might be right, but it doesn't mean you can trust it. You got to test it. You got to examine it under the scope of the current lens of our intellectual property of what we know now. What we know now as people, we know more than we've ever known about ourselves today, because the lies have been pulled apart, and we're free thinkers, and the capacity to gather information has never been as powerful as before. So we can look at Wilhelm Bleek and say, you're a doggone liar. You're a doggone liar. You created something that never existed, and now gave a generation of people a concept that they are this. We are not Bantus. There is no such thing as a Bantu African. All William Bleek did is took West Africans from multiple cultures over. In fact, he said the Bantu is approximately 400 different, or look at the word, species of Africans. How can you go to 400 different ethnicities and nations and call them all one people? 400. It's 402. Because what he was drawing from was that the South Africans spoke differently, and therefore those people can't be these people because they don't have the click consonant. So we refer to the South African as one genotype and refer to all of the others that didn't click as Bantus. It's a mess. Don't trust your history book. You be the history book. This is Del K. Brereton. This is The Real Spiel. Check him out. Wilhelm. I'll spell his name for you so that you can get it. Go to my community page and take a look. I know Black history for them is over, but Black history for us is never over. Wilhelm. Bleek. Bleek. Check him out and see that Wilhelm Bleek was a doggone liar.